know something? Childhood is debatably the greatest time in our lives. No cares in the world, you get everything for free at the expense of your parents, new discoveries are being made every day, and as adults, we constantly drift off into space, recollecting our memories of a time long past in order to escape the harsh and depressing world that is reality. Growing up sucks, kids. On a happier note, whenever I think of my childhood and the video games I played, there's one particular animal mascot that made up the majority of my gaming youth and remains one of the greatest icons of the 90s. I am of course referring to Crash Bandicoot. This guy was Sony's answer to Mario and Sonic back in the day and in the face of the PlayStation for a while, thanks to his tremendous trilogy that put his face on the map and are games that I played religiously growing up, as at the time they were, no better yet, still are in my opinion, some of the best 3D platformers ever created. But that begs the question, which of them is the best? Well, that's why we're here today. And with the N.Sane trilogy right around the corner at the time of this recording, I feel now is the perfect time to determine which game is the greatest our beloved Bandicoot had to offer. So join me everyone, as these games go head to head in order to see which one is the perfect PlayStation platformer. For those not familiar with the format of this series, the categories used for judging will be as follows. And first place in each round gets 3 points, second place gets 2 points, and third place only gets 1 point, and whoever has the most points at the end is the winner. Please keep in mind this video is purely my opinion, and regardless of who wins in the end, the PS1 Crash Bandicoot trilogy are widely regarded as some of the best 3D platformers ever made, and I personally feel this should not be overlooked at any cost. And with all that cleared up, what say we get ready to welcome back an old friend from long ago, by celebrating the games that made him known the world over as the poster boy of the original PlayStation. As video games go, the Crash Bandicoot trilogy aren't anything special in regards to story and characters, but for what it's worth, they get the job done, and at the very least they have a charisma to them that I admire. The story of the original Crash Bandicoot is about our hero Crash, a genetically mutated Bandicoot by the hands of Dr. Neo Cortex and Nitrous Brio, who escapes his prison after a failed experiment and makes it his goal to travel back to Cortex's lab in order to save his girlfriend Torna. And that's about it. No, seriously, that's it. Crash Bandicoot 2 takes place right after the first, where the now defeated Cortex discovers a new power source, crystals.
Of course.
1 year passes, and in order to complete his plans for world domination, Cortex seeks the aid of Crash to collect the remaining 25 crystals, and thank God Crash is a complete idiot, otherwise this plan would have never worked on Cortex's part, even with Coco's many attempts to warn Crash of Cortex's evil. Yeah, by the way, Crash has a sister now. What happened to Torna, you may ask? In terms of canon, she dumps him for Pinstripe, but the real reason? Soccer moms. Finally, Crash 3 takes place immediately after Crash 2, with the Cortex Vortex crashing into the planet and freeing the twin brother of Aku Aku, Uka Uka, who it turns out Cortex was working for the entire time. And since Cortex has screwed up twice already, he plans to take things into his own hands, figuratively speaking, and collect more crystals by travelling through time thanks to Dr. Nefarious Tropy, with Crash and the gang on a quest to stop them. The story in each game I find to be pretty basic and nothing you haven't seen before, but at the very least I don't think they're bad or insulting, they just get the job done. Plus I find the characters to be very enjoyable, and it's for this reason I'm going to give the first point to Crash Bandicoot 2. Crash 2 is where the series really began to establish its tone as well as actually giving its characters distinct personalities, which I feel gives it the best story due to the various times characters pop up and speak to Crash throughout the game. Cortex in particular, who I really like and I always look forward to seeing him on screen whenever possible. Crash Bandicoot 3 is a bit more epic and large than the other two games, and the new characters like Uka Uka are cool, but even with the bosses popping up here and there, I don't feel this game has as much character or enjoyable dialogue as Crash 2, so I ended up preferring Crash 2's story overall. Crash 1 comes in last since the story is otherwise non-existent after the opening cutscene, and barely any characters established throughout the game, acting as pretty much an afterthought, so the winner of the first round is Cortex Strikes Back. I feel the best way to describe the gameplay of Crash Bandicoot is that all three games are rather linear, almost hallway-like 3D platformers with an emphasis on collecting items and constantly moving forward. Due to all the different gameplay styles and refinements the series introduced in each preceding entry, I'm going to take into consideration how much the gameplay and level design works in regards to how the series evolved, as well as its own merits. Crash 1 essentially set the blueprints for the series and has rather straightforward levels of both 2D and 3D platforming, with the occasional hog levels and boulder chase sequence. But each level is cleverly designed around the corresponding theme or environment and makes effective use out of the obstacles and enemies. Crash Bandicoot 2 takes the formula of the original and refines it by introducing new gameplay mechanics, more varied levels and locations each with their own gimmicks and quirks, the now series staple death routes, and getting rid of what didn't work in the original. Mostly. Crash 3 is what I would best describe as a heavily copy and pasted Crash 2 at its core, as it didn't need to make as many changes to what Crash 2 already achieved. However, the level variety here is immense, and even more features like relics and power-ups help to add that extra bit of depth to the game. In terms of which is the strongest, I personally feel that honour goes to Crash Bandicoot Warped. While yes, it is very similar to Crash 2 and isn't nearly as innovative, its greatest strength lies in its level variety. Due to the time travel story, Crash and Coco go through various locations based on specific time periods, which allows for a wide variety of different stages that ranges from your typical series staple platforming of varying degrees, animal riding, motorcycle racing, scuba diving, jet skiing, dogfights in the sky, and so on. This in my opinion helps to keep the game feeling fresh, but it never gets to the point of being out of place or redundant. Plus, I find the levels to be incredibly polished and well structured, making each stage a fun, memorable and unique experience, not to mention the power-ups allow for some very creative platforming challenges and new way of tackling stages. With that said, this is a factor which some feel is a low point of Crash 3, seeing as the game at times strays away from the meat of the series and some of the levels could be seen as either boring or tedious, which I understand and can see why people would be turned off. However, I do not feel the same way, as in my eyes it helps to give the game a nice amount of variety, and I've expressed plenty of times how much I love video games that have a lot of variety. Spice of life, people, spice of life. Crash Bandicoot 2 comes in second, as this game did a magnificent job at refining Crash's controls to otherwise perfection and adding new abilities like the slide and belly flop. On top of that, the levels are excellently constructed, making the best use out of Crash's new abilities and offer exciting stages with no bullshit that have a much greater sense of focus than Crash 3 due to the lack of quote-unquote gimmicks. So for the most part, the levels are great. That is up until the last 10 levels, where from my experience the stages get a lot more boring and basic, and I tend to fall asleep when playing them. And those jetpack levels are far worse than anything Crash 3 throws at you. Seriously speaking here, does anyone like these levels? Because the general consensus seems to be a big fat no. In addition, it's at this point in the game where there are some very frustrating and long-winded levels that otherwise kill the experience for me, which I'll talk about later. Crash 1 comes in last, since while I do find the levels to be fun and well crafted, with lots of interesting set pieces and locations, they really lack variety, as around 90% of them are just platforming, with the Warthog and Boulder levels being what I consider the only unique levels in the game. Furthermore, I find the majority of stages aren't anything particularly amazing to me. I mean, they're not bad for the most part, and they definitely get the job done, but nothing more outside of that. Adding to this is Crash's control, which is generally fine and responsive, but also rather heavy and stiff sometimes, as well as having traction issues, which can make some of the more taxing platforming challenges harder than they should be, along with not much in the way of extra moves outside of jumping and spinning. So for having the most variety, variation and distinguished features, Crash 3 earns its first victory. Graphically speaking, each of these games are incredible for PS1 standards, and to this day, I still think they hold up with some very beautiful and colourful environments, as well as fantastic character animation, giving each game a mountain of charm and livelihood. While they each excel graphically, I think Crash 2 is the best in this department, as this game perfectly captured the look and feel of Crash Bandicoot, and essentially established the type of tone the franchise would follow from then on out. And this also applies to Crash's new model and animations too, making him a much more energetic character, and every action is so damn smooth. Plus it introduced the oh so iconic Crash dance. Yeah, shake that ass! The original Crash Bandicoot comes in second for being the foundation of the franchise, and still having a lot of very nice surroundings and locations peppered throughout the game, and they all reflect the journey Crash goes on, starting out from luscious jungles and streams, to ending up in cold, empty castles and polluted labs. Granted, the character models look a little off, but for something that came out around the time PS1 games looked like this, I can't help but admire what it achieved for the series' first outing. Crash 3 comes in last, since I felt the graphics won a huge jump in quality between this game and Cortex Strikes Back, even with the huge variety of locations based off different time periods, which I must say does make this one of the best looking games on the PlayStation. Plus there are huge amounts of hilarious death animations, and the environments have much bigger draw distances to show off more of the scenery. But when looking at the bigger picture, My eyes are telling me that Crash 2 is this marsupial's Mona Lisa. When it comes to the sound department, the Crash Bandicoot Trilogy is generally pretty strong. Each game's soundtracks are a joy to listen to, and they all fit the mood of their respective games, as there's a wide variety of catchy and atmospheric tunes that set the mood splendidly. Personally, I don't think they're anything along the lines of a Mario or Sonic game, but it's overall good stuff. When it comes to my favourite of the bunch, for a second time in a row, the point goes to Crash 2. Much like the visuals, Cortex Strikes Back is where the music really began to hit its stride, as there's a wonderful collection of songs that I feel fit each level of the game perfectly. These are some incredibly memorable tracks alongside great mixes of stage themes for the secret areas, resulting in a remarkable soundtrack. Second place goes to Warped, as this game's soundtrack is very energetic and blood pumping, which makes the levels feel so much more intense and exciting. Plus, thanks to the various settings the game utilizes, the songs that reflect the particular area sound great. Though I couldn't help but notice that most level themes follow a similar format upon playing this game again recently. This could just be me, but I couldn't help but notice that most of the tracks used were the same bass song, just altered slightly with different instruments. But regardless, the soundtrack is still wonderful. Just not as great as Crash 2's in my opinion. Finally, there's Crash 1, who I can't be too harsh on as it was the first game in the series, and most of the music is more ambient rather than bouncy like the rest of the franchise. This isn't necessarily a bad thing, as the music is still really good and definitely complements each stage. Plus, some of the level things like Insanity Beach and Slippery Climb are some of the best in the series in my opinion, but the majority of the soundtrack simply can't hold a candle to the sequels, so Cortex Strikes Back once again strikes another victory. There's no competition here. Crash Bandicoot Warped wins this round by a mile. The boss fights in Crash 3 are, in my opinion, the best in this series, and I would go so far as to say they're some of my favourite fights in the 3D platforming genre. Each fight is a challenging and blood-pumping battle, yet they're all completely different from each other and so much fun, testing your abilities and reflexes in unique and exciting ways. Even the final boss, which is rather basic at its core, has an amazing atmosphere. Seeing both Aku Aku and Uku Uku go at it during the showdown is a perfect climax to this game. The original Crash Bandicoot comes in second, as while I think the first 3 bosses are pretty boring and forgettable, the last 3 are rather enjoyable to me. Both Pinstripe and Cortex were cool, and I really like the Brio fight in particular, though I distinctly remember shitting my pants when he hulked out back when I played this as a kid. You could literally smell my fear that day. Crash 2 hits rock bottom as the bosses in that game are mostly bleh in my opinion. Granted, Ripperoo and Tiny are alright, but the Komodo Bros are rather bland, Engine is slow and boring, and the Cortex fight is an absolute joke. Like seriously, this battle is pathetic, boring, anticlimactic, and is probably one of the crappiest boss fights in video games. Even the great Cadacarus thinks so. In fact, I'd say this is the lowest point in Crash 2. I can't think of any part of this game that is... Okay, I guess I exaggerated how bad the Cortex battle was. But that doesn't change the fact that I feel Crash 2 is the weakest when it comes to boss fights. And while Crash Bandicoot is overall okay, Crash 3 curse stomps the competition. When it comes to busting balls, the Crash Bandicoot games are relatively tame for standard playthroughs, and no game should cause you to pull your hair out when simply going from beginning to end. The original Crash Bandicoot is definitely the hardest in my opinion, but nothing in this game is too much for the player and the difficulty does scale naturally, so it's challenging but perfectly manageable adventure. Crash 2 I find to be much easier, almost a little too easy in fact, as this game is a breeze to complete and most of the levels can be cleared no sweat, but the game still has a solid difficulty curve from beginning to end. Crash 3 I would say is sort of in that middle ground, not too hard but not too easy. Though some of the more gimmicky levels may throw players off and cause some frustration. After all, I remember those jet ski levels giving me a lot of shit growing up. So all 3 games are decent in the difficulty department. But once you throw gem collecting into the mix, suddenly these games go from Awakening to Radiant Dawn levels of pain! Allow me to elaborate. In order to complete each game 100% and get the most out of them, you have to collect all the gems by breaking every box in each level. Sounds pretty simple, right? Well, it is for Crash 2 and 3, so I'll talk about them first. Out of the 2, I'd say Crash 3 handles gem collecting the best, I don't think there's a single gem in this game that is complete bullshit to collect, and most of the time secret gems are just a case of going through the death routes or finding hidden entrances to the levels. Granted, the motorbike levels can be a bitch when gem hunting, since if you miss a box, you have to start all over again, but aside from that, getting gems isn't too hard or too easy. Crash 2 is mostly the same with its gems, and it definitely improved the method of collecting gems from Crash 1, without a doubt. But there's one glaring issue when it comes to certain gems, and easily the worst aspect of Crash 2's level design: backtracking. As great as Crash 2 is, backtracking is an area that is done very poorly in my opinion, as in the 3D sections that aren't boulder levels, the camera does not accommodate Crash going backwards through the levels, making it difficult to see what's coming up ahead and often leading to sudden death. On top of that, some of the gems that involve backtracking are extremely frustrating to get, as often you have to backtrack for such a long time without dying before reaching the next checkpoint in already difficult areas, most of which either have a fork in the road or a large chunk of box just hidden in the death route, that quickly become very tense and nerve-wracking experiences. And don't get me wrong, Crash 1 and 3 had this issue as well, but no amount of backtracking in those games compared to the likes of digging it, pisting it away, and easily the worst level in the game, cold hard fuck this piece of shit level. I'm gonna sit here and I needed that break. But you know what? As bad as Crash 2 can get at times, it is but a footnote next to the abomination that is gem collecting in Crash 1. God damn, is this shit painful. Not only do you have to deal with the overall hardest game in the trilogy, but in this game you have to break every box without dying after getting a checkpoint, otherwise you skip the box tally at the end of the stage even if you went back and broke every box on the way. Due to this stupid stipulation, Crash Bandicoot quickly becomes one of the most frustrating 3D platformers ever, especially since Crash dies in one hit without an Aku Aku mask, and there will be many times where the controls and Crash's lack of traction got the better of me, and oh, wonderful, just fucking wonderful! This is made so much worse when you have to tackle those really long levels or ones with multiple pathways like Cortex Power, Native Fortress, Slippery Climb, and those godforsaken temple levels. Fuck you, Sunset Vista! You can kiss my blazing blue ass! Then there's the really random shit like the weird TNT glitch when it comes to breaking certain boxes, having to collect colored gems to access hidden areas in previous levels, only to break a very small number of boxes that almost feels pointless, or some levels that expect you to take highly questionable leaps of faith. Like, how on earth was I meant to know there were boxes back here, or that there were invisible platforms here, and here, and here? Getting real tired of your shit game. So yeah, for normal playthroughs each game is fine, but when going from 100%, Crash 1 is a painful procedure, Crash 2 has bullshit backtracking, and Crash 3 is mercifully middle of the road. So I think it's pretty obvious who the winner of this round is. The Crash Bandicoot Trilogy are not very long games, as you can beat them in within a few hours, though gem collecting can otherwise double your playtime for better or worse. However, all three games still offer more to do outside of just reaching the end. Crash 1 I feel doesn't have much to offer in regards to replay value in my opinion, and the process of getting everything arguably isn't worth the trouble. And let's not forget its completely asinine save system, where you can only save after getting a gem or beating a tournament bonus level. Like seriously, what the fuck, Naughty Dog? Though ironically, this is the one I like to speedrun the most for some reason, and it's fun to go back to this game to see the Bandicoot's humble beginnings. Crash 2 has a lot more secret levels and extra sections to discover, and I feel the payoff is far more rewarding than the first game, and I find it a lot of fun to mess around with this game and get some gems earlier than normal. Just look at this right here, and BAM! Red gem before the second warp room. Crash 3 also has a lot of secret levels and additional entrances, but I'd argue they're better integrated into this game through the inclusion of time relics, which you collect by completing levels again as fast as possible in order to access new levels and get the remaining gems, so they're otherwise mandatory for 100% completion. This is an aspect of Crash 3 that tends to split people down the middle, and some of the relics can be a severe case of trial and error, which is fair enough, I understand completely. However, I believe these add a lot more meat to the adventure and test your skills and understanding of the game's mechanics and levels to get the best time. And since I'm a huge fan of Metroid and speedrunning games in general, these are right up my alley. Though those platinum relics really do test my patience sometimes, I can't deny that. So all in all, these games aren't exactly packed to the brim with content, but for what they offer, Crash Bandicoot Warped has the most weight to it. In conclusion, the Crash Bandicoot Trilogy are what I consider some of the best platformers of the early 3D era and still stand as stellar games more than 20 years later. While each game has their positives and negatives, I enjoyed each of them greatly, nostalgia notwithstanding, and I highly recommend these games to any fan of platformers, especially 3D ones. The original Crash Bandicoot is in my eyes the weakest of the three, being the most dated, bare bones and begrudgingly difficult game on top of an already pretty simplistic 3D platformer. Though it's this simplicity which I feel gives Crash Bandicoot its charm, and if you're down with a very straightforward, albeit slightly archaic game for the PlayStation, then give this one a shot and see just what our beloved Bandicoot achieved in its debut. Crash 2 essentially refined the series into what it is, or was until they fucked up everything. Ugh. And it is a very tightly focused and brilliantly designed game that fixed almost every issue that plagued the first game, along with many new additions to create an exceptionally great game, and definitely the one I recommend people start with if they want to get into the series. Just be prepared for some bullshit backtracking and boring bosses. Crash Bandicoot 3 Warped is to me the perfect Crash Bandicoot game. While the jumping quality and innovation isn't as substantial as Crash 2, and you could argue that this game is a bit more gimmicky and all over the place, I personally feel that this is the Crash Bandicoot game that got everything right. The levels are hugely varied and enormously fun, the graphics and animations are some of the best on the PS1, the music is tremendously lively, the bosses are brilliant, there's so much to do after the main adventure, and it's just an all-around fantastic time, and where I feel the Bandicoot was at its best, which is why the winner of this episode of 3FORALL and the overall greatest game of the three is Crash Bandicoot 3 Warped. Thank you all for joining me on this episode of 3FORALL. I have been BLAZINGKNIGHT, and words cannot describe how happy I am to see my childhood hero back in action, and if this new take on the trilogy looks to improve on everything these games lacked, I cannot wait to relive those marvellous memories. Thank you all very much for watching, and I'd like to know your thoughts on this episode of 3FORALL, as well as which game in the Crash Bandicoot trilogy you think is the best. So be sure to let me know in the comments below, and also don't forget to give this video a thumbs up as it helps out the channel greatly, and will definitely motivate me to put more time back into the 3FORALL series. Don't forget to subscribe if you'd like to keep up to date with all my new content, and if you're interested, be sure to check out my last video counting down my top 10 favourite characters in Fire Emblem Echoes. Or how about my last episode of 3FORALL where I pit the Metroid Prime trilogy against each other. Hopefully one of those videos will tickle your fancy. Be sure to follow me on Twitter and Amino at BLAZINGKNIGHT, and I hope you all have a wonderful day. Anyway, that's it from me. I'll see you all next time.